Yeah, so today we are going to talk about corporate co-working. And let me just frame this up a little bit. I'm with Havers and we do research on the work environment. And as you know, everyone is talking about co-working recently. By the way, the market share is still less than 1%, but they are in the news all the time. Co-working spaces. It's kind of like Tesla, like less than 1% market share, but everyone talks about them. So we decided to look into this topic. And 3 years ago, we partnered up with the Fraunhofer Institute in Germany, in Stuttgart, and we looked into commercial co-working and the history, the trends, and etc. And then this was the second phase of the research that we actually decided to look into what's in it for corporations. Because, we as a contract furniture manufacturer, we work with big companies, not necessarily SMEs, and we wanted to understand what's in it for large corporations, co-working spaces. And then the third phase of the research that we are just launching is looking at startup accelerators, startup incubators, and startup campuses. So that's kind of the third phase of our research. So today we are going to talk a little bit about the larger picture, what's shaping our world today. And then, without going into the history of co-working, I'm just going to mention a few of the major milestones that has been happening. And then we'll discuss a little bit of a taxonomy of, what kind of co-working spaces there are. And then I'll talk a little bit about this research. We looked into the drivers for corporations going into co-working, also the benefits they get out of it, space design, culture, how to measure performance, that kind of stuff. And then I'll leave you with some key takeaways and some questions for the future that I don't think anyone knows the answer. So I'll probably just go for about 30, 35 minutes, and we'll have some questions at the end, and we'll get you out by 1 o'clock. So you have probably seen this. And by the way, I was there in Charlotte. I'm a big IFMA fan. I was also there in Barcelona earlier. And of course, some of this stuff everyone talks about. These are kind of the big trends that are shaping our world. The fourth industrial revolution, someone was presenting that it's coming, and someone from the audience said in Charlotte that it's already here. So people are kind of debating. It's kind of like history. In about 10 years, we'll know when exactly it happened. But we know the first three when they happened and what they were about. But the fourth one, according to the World Economic Forum, is around the meshing of cyber and physical systems. So think about, a physical work environment and the digital work environment and the meshing of the two. And according to the World Economic Forum, the number one driver for that is the changing nature of work and flexible work. So I looked into different trends. I talked to a lot of people who are much smarter than I am during this research, and I kind of concluded four big paradoxes that are shaping our world today. The first one is the paradox of disruption. It's kind of the vicious circle of innovation. We know that the best innovation comes from external disruptions. So companies are being disrupted, so they have to let themselves being disrupted in order to disrupt others. It's kind of a vicious circle. And you'll see with some of these co-working spaces, that's the idea, to disrupt yourself. And it's more like a controlled disruption rather than a surprise. The second one is the paradox of innovation. These two companies do not need introduction. You have their products in your pockets today, some of you, both of them. Yet, they are very successful companies, yet they could not be any different. So Google is the quintessential open innovator. Apple is the quintessential closed innovator. Apple, they hire smart people. They like to discover behind closed doors. You probably heard that they built a new headquarters. There's not much news around it, you don't see a lot of pictures, people don't talk about that. But Google, you can go and visit, and it's open doors. And Apple likes to control risk. They have a lot of IPs, and Google, they're hedging the risk. They are profiting from others' use of their IPs. So it's a very different mentality, yet both are extremely successful. And of course, you can think about your own company. Think about your own company. Where are you at innovation? Are you more of an Apple, or are you more of a Google, or maybe somewhere in between? And the third one is space. Of course, it's almost a cliche to say that today we can work from anywhere. We can have a hotspot on the beach. Yet, co-working spaces have become so popular that people are willing to commute there and co-locate. They're called co-working spaces. They're not called teleworking spaces. They are all about co-location. So space has become less and more important at the same time in the last several years. And the fourth one is on a higher level. It's around place. And well, we all know that GE has not moved to downtown Boston, but they have plans. So it's kind of like just the computer graphics here. And Apple, the big donut has landed in Cupertino. So there are two things going on here. The first one is companies, or Zappos would be the other one, occupying downtown offices, and they are using the city as their back office. So, you can have a meeting and then go out, grab a coffee, come back, go out for lunch. So it's an integral part of the city. And Apple is building a fortress, or has built a fortress, so has Facebook or Google. So it's basically a city within a city. So all the facilities, all the amenities, the barbershop, the daycare, the restaurants, the cafes, all are in here. And in this case of the planned GE move, it's all about the city. So these kind of four paradoxes have been shaping our world in the last 5 to 10 years, and they were a perfect ground for co-working spaces to pop up from out of nowhere, like 15 years ago, to like a massive growth in the recent 2 or 3 years. So again, without going through the whole history, there have been papers written about that. Just wanted to go through the major milestones. So it used to be a social movement because, like if you think about Apple again or HP, the two founders, they did not go to a co-working space. They were at home in their garage, messing around, and it took them like months or years to build something. And then, people say like, I don't like to work at home in my pajamas in my garage. I am a social being. I like to go to a co-work. I like to go to a space somewhere. So first, people were getting together, and they figured out that, economies of scale, the rent was, relatively speaking, cheaper if they shared a larger office. So all of a sudden, it was all about getting together and breaking even about the rent. And, some smart people said, well, we can monetize on that. We can build a business around that. And I have some friends who are running their own co-working spaces. And, of course, with every business, the big step comes around, the consumerization of the workplace, or the McDonald's, the Starbucks of the workplace, or the co-working spaces come around. And of course, like the player is WeWork. So its valuation is through the roof. Some people would say, it's $2 billion. Some would say $40 billion. It's kind of like there's a little disagreement there, but everyone has heard the name, and it is happening. It's kind of like Starbucks was, 15 years ago or 20 years ago. And of course, now the corporates are looking into that because, not necessarily just, the space issues, but also innovation. There's a lot of creative innovation coming out of these spaces. So big corporations are looking into that, and some of the brokers are looking into that as well because, it's basically subleasing spaces, and there's a huge profit that can be made on that. So these are the taxonomies that we put together, and you can disagree with that. There might be more or less of these types, but just basically, just to keep it really simple, you got the commercial types, and you got the corporate types, and you got the business to consumer or the business to business types. So the first one is the one that you would think about a co-working space when you read the word co-working. Commercial B2C, it's open to the public, membership based. They're usually freelancers and some corporate users, and the goal is, of course, to make a profit. The second type is very similar, but it's a little bit more buttoned up, a little bit nicer, a little bit higher end. Those are the Rejustice, the Spaces, the Serendipity Labs. Sometimes it's even like a short lease to get into a new country. It's relatively speaking a cheap way to risk-free or low-risk way to get into a new market. And the third one is kind of an interesting animal. This is open to the public, and it's usually free. So the goal here is not profit per se, but more like marketing and sales. So this is when State Farm in Chicago opened up their offices, so anyone can use that as a co-working space. And the idea here is when I, as a startup founder, grow up, I might buy my business insurance from them, or Staples, or ABM Bank would be the other one. I might open up my bank account with them. So it's an interesting model. And of course, they have a lot of surplus space because, when was the last time you went to an insurance agent physically versus, talking on the phone or booking something on the internet? And the fourth one is our topic today is the corporate B2B, which is basically corporations creating their own co-working spaces. So not necessarily just going to a commercial co-working space and renting space, that would be right here, but creating their own co-working spaces with their vendors, with their customers, sometimes even the competition for a greater good. And the goal here is to innovate, to transform. And of course, it's by invitation only, it's closed doors. Involving internal and external people. So it's very important. It's not just a bunch of internal people. It's not just a cross-functional team. It involves external players as well. So let's see what we learned from this research. But before that, I keep saying corporate co-working spaces, but this is not like co-working, the word, it has not been agreed to that, like that's the right terminology for that. So that's why the companies that we investigated globally, 15 companies in North America, South America, and Europe, they have been calling these spaces the campsites, the catalysts, work labs, co-innovation spaces, etc. But as a working definition, just for today's presentation, these are spaces that are co-working-like spaces that are temporary in nature, involve people internally and externally, they're experimental in nature, and usually have a larger agenda of business or cultural transformation. So first we looked at the drivers. Why are corporations creating these co-working spaces internally? And we categorized the results into 3 or 4 buckets. And the first one was around change and transformation. Remember the paradox of disruption. So it is controlled disruption. Create a disruption for themselves individually. It's provoking change, it's experimentation. Many CEOs' dream is to create a startup type culture. So what's better way than actually bringing in the startups and co-working with employees temporarily on a project? The second reason why corporations have been building these spaces was around innovation and creating the startup ecosystem. Cross-pollination of ideas, cross-creation, incubating and prototyping. They have this mentality of fail quick, fail cheap, and learn from the mistakes. One of the executives at Google was in Charlotte at the IFMA conference. I was sitting in the presentation, and he was talking about exactly the same thing. To fail quick, fail cheap, and learn from the mistakes. And if you think about traditional organizations, we are not set up to fail. If you failed, it means that, it might be in your head. We are planning for 2-3 years ahead, and if we are not sticking to the plan, sometimes down to the 10% or 5% deviance, we are not doing a good job. And here is a different story. Hedging the risk outside of the organization is big, because big companies are not set up to fail. So here, we bring in the startups fail. They fail once, twice, 10 times, and then finally we get it. It's not us who failed. It was them who failed. So it's creating this kind of safety net in the organization. But when they win, we both win. We might even buy up the startup after all. The third reason was around future-proofing. Exploration of future of work, accelerated serendipity. It's kind of like creating a Santa Fe type of model here. And it's usually going beyond the company's products, pushing the boundaries, externalizing ideas. The idea here is one of the companies that we investigated was Mini in Brooklyn. The idea was to apply the company values and push the boundaries to other problems. So you don't see any branding here. It's not about the missions of the organization or the vision, because those are like short-term things, maybe 10, 20 years. It's about values. If you think about your own company, what are your values and how can you apply that and go beyond that? Just how IBM was transferred from being a hardware manufacturer to what they're doing right now. A lot of organizations fail to be able to transform, and those are the ones who disappear. But the ones who can transform and apply the same values that their founders created, but just pushing the boundaries, they're the ones who succeed. And this is exactly what these companies are doing. We were interested who the users were of these spaces, and what we found is these spaces are almost always temporary in nature. The users spend there usually about 6 to 9 months or 12 months or sometimes up to 18 months, depends on the project. Some company, in Paris we had one company, they called it the seasons. So they call it the seasons. And I love the term because, like what the season does is they change all the time. It's constant. The change is constant. As I mentioned, it's always internal and external members. And it's a highly creative community. You can apply, but it doesn't mean that, you will be accepted. There's almost always a careful vetting process and preparation as well. There's also a startup mindset. There's a lot of non-core functions that are available quickly. You need a lawyer to vet your project. You got it, like this evening. You need a graphic designer. You don't have to submit a request and wait 2 months until it happens. The graphic designer is sitting around you, and he or she can help you out on the same day. So who is paying for all this, right? The executive sponsors included different people, functional VPs like HR or R&D, CEOs, the founders, different people. And the idea here is, and in one instance, it was a bunch of CEOs from different companies, and they created this idea of co-creating a co-working space and for the greater good of the community around different issues. Depending on the sponsor, the expectations are very different. For example, an HR VP might want cultural transformation, a CEO might want more return on investment, or etc. The culture of these spaces, what we found, differ. So there's no one type of culture, but they're almost always different from the parent organization. There is also a hidden agenda to change the culture, and it's extremely difficult to change the culture. It takes years, but that's kind of usually the hidden agenda. But some of the main common characteristics that we found is obviously higher risk-taking, family spirit, a sense of community, being curious and willingness to learn, and self-initiation, to kind of, do-it-yourself mentality. And all of these, if you read these apply to startups. When you're a startup person, of course, this is in your vein, but not the big corporations. For them, it's a cultural change. Community managers are very important to the success of these spaces. I was down in Mexico a few weeks ago, and I was surprised to learn that even large corporations that has nothing to do with corporate co-working spaces, they have community managers. They draw together people. They kind of know each other, and they point to the right direction. So they connect people, and that's exactly what the community managers do here. Their name includes the feel-good manager or vibe manager, community curators or concierge, and they are very personable, very social, lighthearted. My favorite description was they are icebreakers and 2 legs. They're motivational. They're amazing people. They're embracing change with grace. And they have critical roles, because what we found is that community curation is more important than space curation. The community managers were the #1 reason why users like the space. Just like in regular organizations, large organizations, these organizations have been doing satisfaction surveys. What do you like about the space? Things like free coffee, or amenities, or space design, or ergonomic chairs. And the #1 reason was almost always because of the community manager. So sometimes when they left, the space's success was in jeopardy. Their role is to curate the community, maintain the culture, finding ways to encourage people to bring out the best of themselves. If you stop for a second and think about this is a leadership characteristics, right? Arbitrating conflicts. And yet these people are relatively low paid, and I think they deserve more attention. Some companies, they're hiring them by the twos. So if one leaves or gets sick, they have a substitute. So they're amazing people and very important for the success of these spaces. So of course, being in the space business, Havers, we were looking into how do you design such spaces? What is the branding of these spaces? And what we found was, not surprisingly, that just like culture, the space design is intentionally different than the parent organization. Some of the common characteristics was grassroots styles, temporary in nature, and it's user-centric. It is okay to draw on walls and make a mess. Just think about some of the larger organizations. They have clean desk policies, and they have all these things that get in the way of users. You are the slave of the furniture. You are serving the space rather than vice versa. Here, like what matters is the ideas. What matters is, like to get creative. Everything is on wheels, and it's perfectly okay to make a mess and leave it there until tomorrow. It's usually the space design is managed internally, but purposefully not by the CRA or the FM department, because quite frankly, nobody really knows how to do this, how to manage, how to design these spaces, and it's more like an iterative process. The users are involved, and usually we wanted to understand like what is the right size of these spaces, and what we found is the economies of scale dictates that roughly about 8 to 10,000 square feet is a good number, because anything smaller than that is hard to create the variety of the spaces. If it's only like a few hundred square foot, that's more like a project room. That's not really like a co-working space. And if you go bigger than that, people lose contact and they don't know one another. Engineering serendipity works well. You can create that by centralizing amenities, so people kind of bump into one another. Some researchers call this the engineering serendipity. And I mentioned that the community managers were number one. Why users like the space? Well, number two was inspiring design, and number three is natural light, of course. So number two is important here. There's a lot of designers, I assume, in this space. So we can do a difference with design of these spaces. Nobody wants to go from an ugly cube to another ugly cube. These people were wanting to work in inspiring spaces. So of course the holy grail is like, how do you measure the performance of these spaces? So we asked this question for 15 companies, and there are 4 different type of big buckets. The first one said, very honestly, remember it's okay to fail here. They said, well, we don't measure, we don't use any metrics. They said, like this is a speculative learning process with lots of iterations. If you put like a 3-year plan around this, it wouldn't really happen. It's fine, but the problem here is that since the results are not predefined, they have to be extraordinary. And if you ask 3 people what they expect, you get 3 different expectations of this space. So the second type of group, they are using so-called soft metrics. They said that ideation and innovation is qualitative. It's challenging to measure these with hard metrics. So these are the companies who use user satisfaction survey, pre-post questionnaires. They measure the flow of creative ideas, engagement, learning experience, happiness, etc. And it's worth to mention here that the average user satisfaction in these spaces was around 92%. That's extremely high. And of course, there were companies who measured performance with hard metrics. They counted the number of workshops. They were talking about financial impact, speed. One company said that we can get things done in 2 weeks that normally would take a couple months. And of course, like it also has to do with co-location. Remember that, like you have dedicated teams from the inside and outside that are working on one project 100%. There's no emails, there's no meaningless meetings to attend. You're just focusing down, you're co-located for 2 weeks. It's amazing how much stuff can be done that way. And the fourth type was deferred metrics. They said, well, the real impact will be measured in the long term. We're just trying to keep the burn to a minimum. And then, eventually we would have to come up with a business model to show our sponsor, the CFO or CEO, to build more of these spaces. So we talked about why these companies creating these spaces. But we also wanted to understand what are the unexpected benefits that they did not think they would get out of these spaces. And the first category was around social benefits. There was a lot of networks that created, like notoriously solo employees, like software engineers would also connect. And some of these connections, they survived friendships inside and outside the organization. Increased collaboration, emotional attachments to colleagues, was mentioned. The other type was around the space. These spaces turned out to be great spaces to host events. Also, managers like to hang out here because like they like to escape middle management. They like to escape from office politics. So they were not found here. They were not bugged all the time. They could actually get work done here. And finally, it used to be these places turned out to be great places for tense meetings and negotiations. Because it's very hard to kind of play the ego game when you're sitting around a kitchen table and breaking bread together and drinking wine. It's a different setting than like in a boardroom, for example. And the third type was around business benefits. HR started to realize that they are losing people when they walk in the door because they don't like what they're seeing, the old-style dinosaur-like offices. So they started to interview people in these new spaces, saying that, hey, we are cool, we are trying to change our culture, and you can be part of that. So they were using this as an attraction device, if you will. And also retention. The average space utilization, I think everyone knows in this room, in the US, is roughly around 35%, right? Give or take. So it means that, out of 100 workstations, about 35 is occupied at any given time. Here, there's a wait list to get in. People are wanting to get in. I mean, when was the last time when you had a line in your office building in the morning to get in, right? I want to work here, right? Well, some of you might have, but so these spaces work. Maybe it's because it's something new, I don't know. But these spaces work, and of course not everything is rosy. The next slide will be about what's not working, I promise. And corporate clients, these spaces are not advertised, but of course the word gets out, and corporate clients wanted to meet in these spaces. They were requesting, we heard that you have those spaces, can we meet there instead of the usual boardrooms or conference rooms? So a couple more success stories before we go into what's not working. I mentioned high utilization rates, new methodologies of practices inspired by the startups, innovative products, 30 to 40% cut in product development time. That's huge. And surprisingly easy sell to the CFOs or the CEOs because these spaces are actually lower cost than regular spaces. Maybe it's the density, maybe it's the fact that it's like a grassroots approach. I'm not sure, but these spaces were, if they delivered, when they delivered, they were an easy sell to build some more of these. Engineering serendipity works well. I have this story, I think I have a minute to tell. One of these spaces, they had a startup company, a guy who was sporting a t-shirt, and they were in the restroom. He was standing and doing his job, and a venture capitalist walks in, and he starts to talk to this guy because of this funky t-shirt that he's sporting. And long story short, the guy ended up getting funding, $1.5 million. So if he was working from home out of his garage, it would have taken a lot longer for him to get this funded. Preparing for a presentation pitch, applying to events, that kind of stuff. So it's all about serendipity and planned serendipity. So these are some of the lessons learned, that not everything is rosy here. Some things they needed to learn the hard way. So some spaces cannot look like other spaces at corporate. So some corporations, they just try to do the lip service and try to create spaces that were just another meeting room and call it a co-working space, and of course nobody was using them. Also, it's not all about collaboration. People need individual heads-down focused work to get things done, and if they cannot do that in the space, they have to go home or stay home and do it there, and then they're not there. So what's the point? So you have to draw in the employees and make sure that they are there and they can do whatever they need to do. The importance of community managers, we talked about that. They are the glue of the communities. It is more important to have this than space curation. Also, culture trumps strategy every time is so true. Some companies, it was still not culturally acceptable to work from elsewhere. Hey, you're not at your desk. What are you doing in that funky space? So obviously, it's not for these companies, these spaces. And this is my favorite. These are temporary spaces. So employees go there, they work there for a few months, they have to go back to their original setting. So employees got depressed when they had to go back. So I was joking that maybe they need some reverse change management into their old spaces. And remember that the very first group, you're creating a new organization, if you will, in the organization, a new space. So the very first group that you're putting in this space, their culture will become dominant, and they will define the culture of this space and organization. So it's very important how you select the very first group. So are these companies are just messing around and creating these sandboxes in the organization just for fun, or are they trying to do more in the future? So what we found is scaling was important. Most of them considered this just a prototype, and they tried to scale. They were, of course, the low-hanging fruit is always R&D or engineering. Those are the funky guys, who like to hang around in these spaces. But now they're looking into more traditional like procurement or even HR or IT to scale up. We mentioned that it's cyclical in nature. So startups do two things. They either grow up and they grow out of the space and they get bought up, or they organically grow, or they burn through the cash and they go out of business. So the fun part here is cyclical nature. That's why I love the analogy of the seasons, as I mentioned, because like after fall, it always will be winter, and then the new leaves will come in the spring. Also, these companies know, even though not a lot of them have business plans or performance metrics, hard metrics, they know that in order to scale, they will have to come up with those metrics sooner than later. And economies of scale, of course, they are also aware of that. One space is too small to change the perception of the entire organization, but it's a good first step. And talking about perceptions, if you, just a car analogy quickly, I like cars. This is a supercar built by Nissan. It's like more than $100,000, like a GTR. And Nissan, why did they build this car? It's probably like 0.001% of the population are buying this car, right? Well, it's all about perception. It's all about creating an image and perception. So the idea here is, do these corporations, are these corporations able to create a perception that they can change that old style culture and they can move into a different segment? So just to close down quickly, so we talked about change and transformation. A lot of companies, of course, when you go to these conferences, like in Barcelona, with IFMA, is about digital transformation. A lot of companies are talking about that. And the key to success is the space and the community, and community being even more important than space. Community managers are extremely important. We talked about that it is okay to use soft metrics. Sometimes it's a little stretch for some organizations, but it is okay to use soft metrics. Serendipity can be engineered, as we saw. And it's a constant learning process. I guarantee you that if you're trying to do this, you will fail the first time. But the most important is to learn from these and create a better and better approaches. And finally, we said that culture and space design are intentionally different from corporations. So these are the questions that I promised that I would leave you at the end, that I don't know the answers, but it's worth thinking about it. So we talked about innovation. So what is the future of innovation? Is it open innovation or is it closed innovation? If you think about your company, where are you heading with that model? What is the future of organizations? A lot of people have been talking about the Hollywood model in the last 10 years. It's the project-based organizations. The organizations that operate like movie companies, where a producer or a program manager would hire a director or a project manager who would put together a team, a cross-functional team in organizations, and they would do a movie for 6 months, or they would deliver a project for 6 months, and then they would move on with their lives. They might go on vacations, and when they come back, the director always hires back the people, the A team, the A players, the best players. When you work in traditional organizations, we are stuck with colleagues, whether we like them or not. We sometimes have a lot of business. We are working 90 hours a week, and sometimes there's nothing to do, and we have to let people go. So in the project-based organizations, that never happens, right? It's a project-based organization. So that brings up the question: what is the future of the workplace? Is it co-working? Is it activity-based work? Are there any difference? So how do you design workspaces for the future of organizations? Because I guarantee, I don't know how the future will be, but I guarantee it's not going to be the same as in the past 100 years with the Christmas tree-like organizational charts and very hierarchical and very old-school organizations. And finally, what are the future of cities? Like in San Diego here, are we going to work and live in downtown offices or more in suburban campuses? So this is my last slide. Since we talked about movies, I wanted to throw up some credits here from the Co-working Manifesto. So on the left side here, you can see the old ways of doing business. And some of you, including probably ourselves as well, we are mostly on the left side here. And on the right side is this kind of new ways of doing business. That's the co-working model. So it's all about collaboration versus competition. It's about communities versus agendas. It's all about participation and doing rather than just observing and saying. It's about friendships versus formalities, boldness versus assurance. And the most important is learning. It's not who the expert is in the room. And it's about people and connections and friendships versus personalities and egos. And it's about the value ecosystem versus the value chain. So the question is, can your organization make the leap to the right side? So we'll stop here, and I think we have a little bit of time for questions. Thank you.
Any questions for Dr. Nagy?
Yes.
So you say make the space, or on several slides you reference making the space not look like the rest of corporate space. Can they coexist in the same building, floor, whatever, or are you advocating that they have to be somewhere else entirely?
Very good question. Did everyone hear the question, or do I have to repeat it? Repeat? Yeah, so the question was, these funky spaces, these new types of spaces, can they coexist in the old organization, or do they have to be physically in a different place? And we've seen both. I would say that probably, it depends on the organization, depends on the culture, but it's probably a safer bet if it's not in a safe place, in the same place. I'll tell you a personal story, which I think most of you can relate to. I go back to our headquarters in Michigan, and of course, we have different meetings, and sometimes we have meetings that we are talking about something radically different, something like a new something, like an ideation. That's my group used to be called ideation. And we purposefully we pay money and book a different room rather than staying at HQ, because when you're there, you're drawn into other meetings, and you have this mindset of, oh, we have tried it before, it's not going to work. So you need to open up, and the space is not going to make you more creative. It's not going to change your culture, but it helps opening up the minds. And when you're in a different space, you feel that okay, so it's okay to behave differently. So I think it's a very powerful tool.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Yes.
What types of partnerships and companies are you seeing, like some examples of different companies that are co-working together?
So the question was, what type of partnerships have you seen? Different types of companies working together. What do you mean by partnerships?
What if there's multiple companies in the same co-working space? What are some examples of those companies? I'm just curious.
Yes, so I cannot give you all the names. I mentioned one, like Mini, for example. Orange was another one in Paris. And these are the companies, by the way, they agreed to share their names. And I put up an article recently in HBR around this topic. Some of the partnerships are more loose, and some are more structured in a way that what happens if we win? Who is going to own the IP and that kind of stuff? There's a lot of questions, right? And sometimes these are competition. And I'm just making this up. It's not true. I'm just making this up as an example. Let's say BMW and Mercedes, like arch rivals, right? The two big rivals. They join forces to build a car that runs on water, for example, right? Both of them will benefit at the outcome, but none of them are big enough to pull it them by themselves. The other partnerships are more around customers, like a vendor with a customer. So we think we know what the customer wants, but we meet with them once in a while and we have questions. Well, that's great, but what if we work together and they are coming up together with the idea with us? That's a whole different story. So that's another type of partnership. Yeah. Yes.
I'm sure we're all appreciating that great point. And is this PowerPoint going to be available on the website? Is that something you can share?
We haven't discussed, but yes, it can be. Yeah, it can be available.
PowerPoint, but also the presentation. So this device here, the swivel, which you guys have all seen here for the past year or so, that followed Dr. Nagy around all day like a creepy stalker.
Yes. But the presentation itself, it's just a bunch of bullets. So if you want to read more, there is an HBR article that I recently wrote. It's online. It's accessible. It's either on my LinkedIn page, or if you go to havers.com, it's up there. And there's also a longer article that we put out, a white paper that you can download free of charge from our website. Yeah.
We'll add a link to your LinkedIn on there.
Yeah. Just shoot me a message and or like a connect request, and yeah.
Give us a few days and it'll be on the recaps page on the website, which is new, by the way. You guys should check it out.
And I can send
One
you.
side of the year on purpose.
And I can send you the information so that you can disseminate. That's probably the most
That sounds good.
powerful.
Yeah, thank you. Any last questions?
Yes.
Yeah, please.
So in the future design of the office space, would you see any daycare facilities, or is that a trend that's growing?
Yes. So do I see any daycare for children, right? Daycare facilities in the future of offices? I'm trying to think. I was in Charlotte. Yeah, I think it was in Charlotte because I've been going around conferences. No, it was in Juicy in London. I was at the Juicy conference in London, and someone created a startup company just exactly for that. She was looking for a company to work for a company as a new mom, and she couldn't find it. So she said, like, but I'm gonna start a startup around that. So she just provided that. So I think, like as people are more savvy around the work-life, not balance, but mixture, like blending, there will be more demand for that. And, like world-class companies, they're already providing that. But I think the mainstream will follow. So I totally agree that, like that's just one example of the amenities. There are several other needs that people need. And if we are working from home, that's great because we can take care of our children, but we are missing out on many things, right? We are like out of the picture. So how can you blend the two? I think it's an excellent point. Yes?
I was at the IFMA World Workplace and sat at one of the sessions, and as you mentioned, Apple being so closed, there was an actual guest there, one of the members, that his job was to sustain and take care of dogs.
At Apple?
At Apple.
Oh,
that's all
okay.
he did.
Yeah, that sounds like a great job if you like dogs.
From beginning to end. We're like, what's your job title?
Yeah.
He took care of dogs.
That's awesome. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
The furry friends.
Yeah.
They could take him in, and then it's his job to basically manage those animals all day long.
Yeah.
They never leave.
Yeah, I heard companies that they have this like three like rules of like first like if the dog misbehaves, and then the second time, the third time, the dog is out, right? Too much barking.
Misbehaves then.
Yeah.
He goes to doggy timeout.
Doggy timeout. Okay. Any last questions?
Yeah. Any last questions?
Well, it's been truly enlightening, Dr. Nagy. Hey,
Thank you
so much for having us.
Thank you, Steve.